I feel like this video needs a preface. I originally started this video in February and wanted to launch it no later than April. Had I made my deadlines, I wouldn't need this explanation that you're watching right now. You see, the whole point of this video was to show you a low-cost AM4-based gaming system you can build right now, and then upgrade later, making use of AM4's ace-in-the-hole upgrade potential. You know, when some mysterious future game comes along that needs more CPU or GPU horsepower than this little machine can provide. But as you probably guessed, production slipped as I struggled with scope and writing an interesting script. Time slipped by as I struggled with real-life obligations. Eventually, though, I got a handle on the video, tied up the scope, and finished off testing. But as I was getting ready to edit the video down for release, that mysterious future game arrived. Starfield launched to howls of indignation from mid-range gamers realizing they'd no longer be able to drag all the sliders to the right and get 60 FPS. Amid this controversy, I decided to test the game on this hardware. After all, it was solidly below minimum spec. How bad would it be, really? I didn't know what to expect, but what I got surprised me even more. I wasn't expecting how well it ran. I even streamed my experimentations live. By the way, I stream every Saturday afternoon if you want to come and chat while I commit computer hardware atrocities like this one. The game honestly impressed me. The frame time graph was smooth, the controls remained responsive down to around 35 FPS, and once you got a handle on the frankly horrific graphical options menu, you could get the game to look pretty good as well. But the complaints from the internet kept coming, and I started to doubt the work I'd done benchmarking this game on this hardware. Would I be roasted immediately for saying that 35 FPS is fine, actually? Does the comparatively abysmal performance of Ryzen 5 1600 immediately invalidate my video's premise? Is the Ryzen 5 1600 actually best avoided now because of this game? I mean, maybe. Thus, you see my struggle with releasing this video in its original form. Instead, why don't we have a look at what the 1600 can do in 2023 and what some maybe better options are these days. All set? Bottoms up. Before we jump into the details, let's quickly cover the test system specifications. The motherboard, as you saw in my intro video, is my PCI Express test bench motherboard, an Asus A320MK. As I showed in my 5600X3D on older motherboards video, the specific version of AMD's Promontory chipset that you're using doesn't really matter in terms of raw gaming performance, so if you're looking to build a system from used AM4 components, don't be afraid of less expensive A320 and A520 motherboards, assuming the price is right. The primary GPU used for testing today is the GTX 1660 Super from the $100 GPUs video a few weeks back. I feel like this card is a solid budget choice for someone who probably does more than just game on their computer, as you get solid video encoding, streaming, and compute acceleration, along with its okay gaming performance. The rest of the components are pretty standard. 16 gigs of reasonably fast RAM has dropped down to just $30 nowadays, and of course, add a cheap tower cooler, though mine's a couple of years old now, so it's quite possible to get much better coolers for those $20 these days. And of course, add your own power supply in case of choice. Here I'm just using a basic 500-watt Thermaltake Smart Unit and one of my 3D printed test benches. Your total platform cost minus case and power supply ends up well under $250, giving you a complete functional gaming PC for less than the cost of an RTX 50 alone. Skip the ray tracing and the warranty on a 3050 and get a free computer. There's got to be a catch, right? Well, yeah. There's a reason the secondary market is pricing the R5 1600 at $30, and we'll probably find out why in this video. So, without further ado, let's dive in to the world of cheap Ryzen. Starting out with BeamNG Drive, and the R5 1600 is capable of processing about 227 million beams per second. This results in excellent frame rates at 1080p, seen here in the Flood Escape Crater map running the BeamNG multiplayer mod. We're getting between 80 and 100 FPS at the normal preset, and the frame time graph is quite smooth. Hacking on into Cyberpunk, and the built-in benchmark returns 69 nice FPS, although actually getting out and walking around Night City returns a CPU-limited mid-50s at 900p high preset. Checking in on PC emulation using DOSBox, we find the R5-1600 able to deliver an average of 36.6 FPS in Quake at 640 by 480, using Phil's DOS benchmark pack in a default DOSBox install. Jetting over to Cities Skylines, and the poor Ryzen 5 can only deliver about 20 FPS at maximum simulation speed in my transit-heavy test city. The 1660 Super is practically asleep here at 1080p, showing under 40% utilization. One last flat game here before we dive into VR, and that's Resident Evil 4 Remake, at least the demo, running the prioritized graphics preset at 900p. We get between 65 and 75 FPS outdoors with much better frame rates indoors. The 1660 Super here really gets to stretch its legs in this one. Dropping a portal over to VRChat, and we've got my favorite CPU benchmark world up first, the After Dark Plaza. This world is chock full of objects and udon scripts, and really brings CPUs to their knees. No less so in the casino area, the most demanding area of the map, where the Ryzen 5 1600 returns a measly 23 frames per second. Up next is the Blender Classroom benchmark world. Here the 1600 puts up a similar fight, returning just 21 FPS at minimum render scale on my Vive Pro. Lastly, we have rainy Cyberpunk City, which is usually a GPU-heavy world, although the R5 1600 challenges that assumption, with just 30 FPS at 90% render scale and 85% GPU utilization. There's one last world I wanted to show you, but it's the one world that actually failed on this CPU. VRChat Doom fails to load within VRChat's world loading timeout window, and after a couple of attempts dumps you at the super rare White Hell Error world. Never seen that before. VRChat isn't all of VR, but it's the most CPU demanding by far. Most other VR apps and games run pretty well on this setup, especially perennial faves like Beat Saber or Synth Riders here, which maintains a locked 90 FPS at 90% render scale on my Vive Pro. And is way more fun than Beat Saber anyway. Okay, now it's time for the game whose name starts with star and ends with field. Bet you can't guess what it is. I played the initial 90 minutes of this game's opening and main quest on this setup, although I was initially using the RX 5600 XT before I swapped in the 1660 Super for official benchmarking. This was well before I or anyone else realized that Starfield really doesn't like NVIDIA GPUs, but I wasn't originally building this system for Starfield anyway, and I wanted to keep the benchmarks consistent. Even with the considerable handicap of the NVIDIA GPU, the Ryzen 1600 will struggle to return 30 FPS in heavily populated towns in the game, though outposts, space combat, and interiors run significantly better thanks to the lower CPU load. In my official test area of New Atlantis, the budget AM4 machine returns an average of 35 FPS as long as you're not loading in new cell data while you're wandering around the city, in which case, frames start to stutter and I've seen frame rate drop as low as 20 FPS during loading, although it's only momentary. Planet-side combat usually runs between 35 and 45 FPS depending on what you're doing, and interiors run fairly well, usually keeping around the mid-40s. Okay, let's talk alternatives to the Ryzen 5 1600. Now before you come at me with pitchforks, hear me out. I think the best alternative option for a used parts, low-end AM4 system, assuming your budget is fixed and has no wiggle room, is the Ryzen 3 3100, a 4-core 8-thread Zen 2 part. Hang on, let me explain. As I'm recording this, the Ryzen 3 3100 goes for about $50 buy it now on US eBay. However, If you're patient, you can frequently find it for closer to $40, or, say in this case here, $53 with a Wraith Stealth, making it just $3 more than the 1600 with a $20 cooler. But why would you do this? Well, let's say, in the hypothetical future, you decide to upgrade your GPU from the GTX 1660 Super to an RX 6650 XT. Don't shoot me, it's just what I have laying around. Now, in Starfield, in my New Atlantis test area here, you upgrade your GPU and your frame rates improve from 30 FPS to 49 FPS. Substantial, but if you'd first built your system using an R3 instead, you'd be getting 55 FPS. In Cyberpunk, the difference is less stark, but it's still there. Upgrade to a 6650 XT, and the Ryzen 5 1600 goes from 69 FPS to 85 FPS. If it was the 3100 instead, 89 FPS. One last thing to note, I didn't test the 3100 incredibly thoroughly in VR, but I did try VRChat Doom on it, and it loaded up quite happily and played well, so there's that too. Suffice to say, I think the 3100 is a better low-end AM4 choice if you know you need more performance than the 1600 can provide, but you have literally no budget for that performance. Now I know what you're saying. Why not the Ryzen 5 3600? Why give up those 2 cores? The simple answer is price. The used CPU market for AM4 is completely bonkers right now. The Ryzen 5 3600 goes for $75 buy it now for a working example. That's just the CPU alone, no cooler. Add that $20 cooler we were looking at and you're suddenly paying $95 for a used CPU when the Ryzen 5 5500 is $90 in a box with a Wraith Stealth. Or the 4500 is $70 with a box cooler. The R3 3100 is the highest performance CPU that I'd buy used for this platform if my budget was under $100 for the CPU. Anything between the 3100 and the Ryzen 5 5600 non-X doesn't make sense to buy used at this time because new CPU prices, that include box coolers, are so competitive. Now, that being said, I will be testing the Ryzen 5 3600X and the Ryzen 5 5500 against one another in the next video in this series to see which one makes sense for a mid-low range AM4 system. Honestly, I have no idea how that one's going to turn out. The 3600 has more cache, but it's an older architecture, while the 5500 is Zen 3, but it has less cache and is monolithic. Which will be faster? I really have no idea. I'm as interested to find out as you are. So, with that said, if you could be so kind as to click the buttons below to let YouTube know that you liked this video and you'd like to see more of them like it, I'd really appreciate it. And with that, I think it's time to wish you all the best of luck on your PC building journeys. May the PC parts be ever in your favor, and by all that's willing, have a great night.